Hello, I'm Robert, fact checker and science blog, and helping people scared of many things for our Facebook group Doomsday Debunked. I just realised I maybe created a false impression with my intro. This is voluntary, I should say voluntary, fact checker and science blogger. My actual work is self-employed software developer, and I don't get paid anything for this. So this time I want to talk about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and this some people, if you are Catholic or if you belong to the Christian Protestants in the Bible Belt in the United States, or some other Christians who have a very strong views about abortion, then this is a very important topic for you. So people share these fact checks, but sadly I went and I'd been either sharing the fact checks or just summarising them, and then I realised that there's some mistakes in the fact checks. So, and this is of course very important for certain people to get this exactly right. So I've been done careful research to find out what the true situation is. So the short summary is, if you are a Catholic, you're fine. And if you are a Buddhist also, because I'm Buddhist, then you're absolutely fine. And I would, and for the protests, for the Protestants too, and then for most, I would think for just about all religions, then you are fine. But it's especially tricky for the Catholics, because they have the idea of an abortion as being a sin, and you don't want to be associated with it at all if you can possibly not be. So let me try and explain why it is that the Catholic bishops in the United States, and they have said it's okay for Catholics to have these vaccines. And so I want to explain, and these fact checks have not explained it properly. Please bear with me, because it's really quite complex to explain. So first of all, no vaccines are ever grown in fetal tissue. That's not what this is about. But this is something that only happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. I don't think they're any later than the 1970s, correct me if I'm wrong. And we would now, if we were making a cell line, we have much better ways of doing it. We would use stem cells. So that's one of the first mistakes that these fact checks that I found, nearly all of them said that these were stem cells from aborted fetuses. That doesn't really make much sense, because you can get stem cells from adults. For instance, from bone marrow would have been an early way of getting stem cells. You wouldn't have needed to go to an aborted fetus for one of those. These are not stem cells. And indeed, they go back to the 1960s, and when indeed they go back to before, there was proof that stem cells really existed. They were just a hypothesis. And so there's obviously no way that they could be stem cells. So anyway, so they are actually, but they are cell lines from tissue from fetuses. So the most important thing for the Catholic to realise, so I'll try and keep on essentials and then I'll go to the more details a bit later. The most important thing for the Catholic to realise is that it's ethical in the sense that the aborted fetus was legal and ethical back then, and it can't be changed because it's a historical thing in the past. But it was never in any sense unethical or legal in terms of the laws of the country in which the abortion happened. And they were not aborted in order to produce vaccines. That would be deeply illegal anywhere, at any time. That didn't happen. And so what happened? It could in some cases be a medical emergency, in which you've got a woman who is going to die. There's no way that the fetus can survive, and the fetus has to be aborted in order to save her life. That happens sometimes. But the people who made these cell lines, then they weren't Catholics. They weren't thinking like Catholics, and these could be any aborted fetus where it was an legal elected abortion. And then what happens is that some women, and it's always going to be a very sad occasion for a woman if she has to have an abortion. And then some women who have got a strong medical background, then they might think that they might feel that they can do something positive, that they can donate the fetus, who has, after all, they would think has died, and if they think there's another life, then it's gone on to that other life already, and they would then say, well, we can donate the or an afterlife, or however you think, then or Buddhist another life, then they would say, well, I'll donate the tissue of the fetus for medical science to help other babies. So that can be, for some women, that can be quite a positive thing to do in that awful moment when they've had to have an abortion. So so that is very ethical. That is the situation in which then it's given to medical research. Now, most fetuses that are given to medical research will not be used to generate cell lines. So the next thing is that these are actually their fibroblasts, which are a particular kind of cell for the connective tissue in a young embryo. In an embryo, actually late stage embryo. The very first one that this was done for was 4 months, so quite a late stage embryo. So, I mean, for Catholics, that if you felt that you were in some way involved in the actual abortion, then for Catholics you would think that was a sin. So, but you are not in any way involved in this abortion because it happened over half a century ago, and nothing you do can change what actually happened. So then the Catholics and the bioethicists then have to think about, what do we do about something? You've got these cells so what happened after that? And you don't have any of the cells from this abortion none of those cells are actually in any vaccine either. So what happened is that the cells are the basis of a cell line, and this was a discovery that they made in the 1960s, that you can reproduce the cells over and over and over again, and eventually it stops at between 40 and 50 doublings, which takes you to something like 1 million billion or something like that cells. Anyway, if you work out the maths, then it turns out that you've got something, you can get like 20 million metric tons of human cells from a small amount of tissue that comes from a single ethically donated fetus. And so obviously all those metric tons of human cells, they're not the actual cells of the original fetus. Those cells are long gone, not so long after. They'd be kept frozen in liquid nitrogen, then they used to grow new cultures from time to time, and then those cultures are propagated on, and so that's how it works. And then, so then, if we look at the vaccines, then most vaccines are not made in this way anymore, because it's been several decades, a couple of decades or so, I'm not sure how long it is, but it's been quite a while since we've needed to use this process. But what happens is that, for instance, the very early vaccines were actually developed in the cell lines. And so one example is the rubella vaccine, and this was developed in these cell lines. And and you might wonder why embryos. Well, first because they're very young cells, so they can reproduce on and on, and do an awful lot of doubling. And then also because if it's an embryo, then they have not had any of the diseases of adults. And so you can get a very clean cell line, and then you study the cell line and you understand it very well. Each one's going to be different because they're different DNA. And then the cell lines are used in different ways. For instance, they can be used to actually grow the virus instead of the vaccine, and the virus then is used to challenge the vaccine as a very early test to see if the vaccine works. And you need to do that, obviously, in human cells. So you can see how the vaccine works in human cells that have been infected with the virus, which are not a person, but just a cell culture. So that would be an example where you absolutely have to use human cells, because you're wanting to test what it does to the virus in a human cell culture. And then some vaccines, there are lots of ways you can make vaccines, and some are made in hen's eggs, for instance. But many vaccines do need to be made in human cells. So then that's the question is, you get a few cells, someone donates a few cells or whatever, but how are you going to make the vast number of cells, get the vast number of cells you need to make lots and lots of batches of vaccines? They have to be human cells for some vaccines. And then you also don't want them contaminated with viruses and things, that some adults might have diseases, and so again you obviously don't want any of those diseases to have any risk at all of them getting into the vaccine. So you have to have a very clean cell line. And then if you're doing the safety testing, then you want all the vaccines to be produced as identically as possible. So you have a very uniform production of vaccines. So then you can do the trials, and you know that what you're actually vaccinating people with is the same vaccine produced in the same way as was used in the clinical trials. So lots of reasons why you need a proper cell culture. And then once historically these particular cell cultures have been developed over the decades, then they're understood very well. So that's why you might even nowadays, even with a modern vaccine, you might use one of these cell lines. So the situation is that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are not cultivated in any cell line derived from an aborted fetus, although they have used the viruses grown in cells of the actual natural virus grown in cell lines in experiments to test the vaccine. So it's not completely pure of any contamination in the experiments. So that's where you think about, is this a problem? And the way the Catholic ethicists reason, and they say that it is not a sin because you are doing it out of kindness and out of love, about neighbourly love for your community around you and to protect your own health. And they say that this is actually required of a Christian, that you shouldn't refuse this vaccine because you are doing something that is actually benefiting the people around you, and also benefiting your own life is also important. So, and especially when you consider that nothing, whether you receive the vaccine or not, has absolutely no effect at all on an abortion that happened over half a century ago. So, and then with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the connection is very remote. That there was some of the experiments to test the vaccines involved using the cell line, and also some of the early research in developing the technology of messenger RNA, its use, being able to kind of stabilize and do different things with it. Then that also involved using these cell lines, which then led on eventually to the vaccines. But the vaccines themselves are not grown in these cell lines. Now, a well-known vaccine that many of your children will have had if you're Catholic family, for instance, or if you're Catholic when you were a child, is the MMR vaccine, and it's neither of the two M's but the R, the rubella vaccine. Then that is made in one of these cell lines from an early 1960s abortion. And none of the actual cells from the fetus, as I said, is in the cell line, obviously, because it's long ancient ancestors, but also there are no human cells in the vaccine. So the reason is because when they grow the vaccines hijack the cellular machinery inside the cell, and then the cell basically explodes, or just disintegrates, and it scatters out viruses everywhere, vaccines everywhere, and then those vaccines then harvested, they are purified of anything to do with the original human cells, because that's the best vaccine. So they will have purified as far as possible everything there is of the original human cell. I tried to find out if there could be anything left by way of a little bit of DNA, and I can't find, got people saying opposite things there, and neither of them provided sources, and I can't find a paper that actually researches into this. But I think it'd be surprising there'd be much by way of the DNA, because DNA is not stable outside a virus or outside a cell. It needs a lot of structure around it to keep it stable. So I rather suspect there's probably not very much by DNA. There could be bits of tiny fragments of DNA. If anybody knows about that, do say. Or tiny fragments of that, like the bases that make up the DNA or something. But probably not any kind of really stabilized DNA. But do correct me if you happen to know anything about that. So all you really have in the vaccine, if there could be some chemicals that are in some way connected with the human cells in some ways, but you almost just about everything you have there that is in any way connected with this cell line is just the vaccine itself, because that's the aim, to purify the vaccine, and you wouldn't expect to have very much else, because that's what you're trying to do to create the vaccine. So that is the rubella vaccine, and the Catholic Church has ruled that it is okay, or they've made the ethical examination of this in great detail, and they came to the conclusion that this is okay. So then, if you go and look at the three ones that have been approved so far, this again is a thing that just about all the fact checks I read got this wrong. The Astrazeneca vaccine is grown in one of these cell lines, a human cell line from just like the rubella vaccine. And I haven't found out why, but it is likely that it is because this particular cell line they knew would work with a particular adenovirus from the chimpanzee that they needed to reproduce in a human cell line. So that would stop them having to go through all the business of creating a new cell line from scratch or something. There can be particular reasons why you choose a particular cell line. So for whatever the reason is, I haven't checked that as to why they did it, but the AstraZeneca vaccine is grown in one of these human cell lines. So it's a very similar situation to rubella. So the Catholic bioethicists, and this was particularly the Catholic bishops from the United States, then they came to the conclusion, and their recommendation for Catholics in the United States, but Catholics worldwide, it's the same vaccines, then if you are given the choice between the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine, if you're a Catholic, then they recommend that you choose either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. However, in most situations you won't have the choice. So if you go in and get vaccinated, the nurse asks you, which do you want, the Pfizer, Moderna or the AstraZeneca one, go for the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. But if you don't have the choice, then just go for whichever vaccine they offer you, because they say that the most important thing is to get immunized, get vaccinated, in order to protect yourself and to protect your community, and out of the neighbourly love for the people around you. Because it will, although they don't know yet the details, it certainly will stop some transmission. They don't know yet how much, and it will protect your own health, and your own health is important as a Christian. So it's absolutely clear, and so they say you shouldn't delay it. That is, if you're in a situation, obviously if you're in New Zealand, where there's no risk at all, because it's already virus-free, then you can wait for as long as needed. But if you're thinking about getting vaccinated anyway, then it's not going to be an urgent matter, because you haven't got any risk of getting COVID. But if you have significant risk of getting COVID and passing it on to others, or being sick yourself, then definitely they say don't delay getting vaccinated in order to have your preferred vaccine. Just have whichever one they offer you. And also, I mean, it's causing problems for the people who are vaccinating you. So, I'm saying what sorry, I got a bit distracted there. I'm saying what the Catholics say. So if you are belonging to a different religion or a different branch of Christianity, then you may have to make your own decisions. For myself as a Buddhist, for Buddhists like myself, then the situation is really very simple, because there is no connection with the original abortion, that this cell line, you're not going to do anything that will in any way affect that abortion that happened so many decades ago. And so the way Buddhists think about it, you don't have any connection with it. So it's very simple for a Buddhist. It doesn't matter which of the cell lines. The cell line's already there, and Buddhists, we don't think about it in terms of sin in the way that Catholics do. We don't think that you're in some way kind of tinged with the sin that the cell line came from, or something like that, of what for a Catholic is a sinful thing that you shouldn't be involved in. So it's not like that for Buddhists. We just don't think like that. We just look at the consequences right now of our actions, and in no way are you killing any living being by receiving the vaccine. So that would be how a Buddhist would think about it, and so it's absolutely clear for Buddhists, and I would expect also for Hindus too. And so for many religions, so these two things. But if you're Protestant, then you have to think carefully about how it applies to your situation, or maybe you can find someone who has already done for your particular denomination done a determination of what it means. But I would say for Christians generally, it's really quite important. Neighbourly love and your own life is important too. And so because Christians do think of this life as being something, it's a God-given thing, and something that the product of God's love in this world, and in that situation it's important to preserve your own life as well. You may not understand it, it might not be very clear why God has given you this particular life, which makes it seem to have all sorts of problems. You might wonder what on earth your role is in life and so on. But for that's the way Christians think about it, that you are in this world because God, out of his love, and he brought you into this world like this. So there's some things for you to do, and you're here for a purpose, and even though you may not understand it, and that you are instantiating the love of God in whatever you're doing, and so it's very important to preserve your life. So that's how many Christians would think about it. So again, even if you're not a Catholic, it's still very important to look after your own life as well as looking after the life of others. So so that's pretty much sorts it out for. I think I've sorted out pretty much all of the kind of religious angle of this. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about the scientific background of the actual, the things that actually happened. There were some interesting points about the whole thing. Explain a little bit more about stem cells and about. So some of you can probably just stop at this point. But I'll talk a little bit more. And if you've got any questions, then do say in comments, then I can respond to comments and do another video or something. So well, first of all, if you go and look at the link, I should just say this before you. There's the ethical statement. So I have a link to the article to my own article in the video description. And then if you go and look at that, that's got links. So this is the ethical statement from US bishops, Catholic bishops. So yes, let's just look at that. So it's sufficiently serious to justify their use despite their remote connection to morally compromised cell lines. That's what they say about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And it should be understood as an act of charity toward the other members of our community, and this especially serious is about your own health, and then this is about your act of charity towards other members of our community. And it should be considered an act of love for our neighbour and part of our moral responsibility for that common good. Actually, that doesn't talk about And it doesn't actually explain this other thing that I was talking about. But then they say again, the lack of alternative vaccines. I can bring up the full statement, and maybe I should check that I haven't added stuff to that. Part of that, I'll bring up that other statement and I can look at it. I'll look at that at the end, so I'll have a little bit more about all this. So, yes, so it says, this is the bit I said about the delay. It may turn out, however, that one does not really have a choice of vaccine, at least not without a lengthy delay in immunisation that may have serious consequences for one's, well, there we are, that's for one's health and health of others. So they are talking about how your own health is also important. So serious consequences for one's health and serious consequences for the health of others. Those are both important to a Catholic. It's not just that you only do it if it's the health of others that are affected. You do need to think about your own health as well. And so that was the point I was saying. I've elaborated it on more than the way they put it there, a very simple statement. They have elaborated it a bit and explained the background of a Christian. But that is a point you need to bear in mind. And given the lack of alternative vaccines and the fact the connection between an abortion that occurred decades ago and receiving a vaccine produced today is remote, inoculation with the new COVID-19 vaccines in these circumstances can be morally justified. And so whatever vaccine you're offered, then none of them are going to be an actual sin according to Catholic ways of understanding, and the whatever slight tinge of the connection with this ancient aborted fetus decades ago is completely overridden by the act of kindness and generosity and love for your neighbour that you are showing by getting vaccinated, and the benefit to your own health, but is also important. So I just want to talk a little bit about the new vaccines then. So so that's everything on the statement. I think I've clarified everything there. So that would be relevant to the people who would be asked questions about this. And so the most new vaccines, I just want to explain this bit about new vaccines, that if they need human cells, they use these immortal stem cells. So I briefly mentioned them. The immortal stem cells, they are cells that are in your body that can be used to regenerate new cells at any point in your life. So you're not just stuck with whatever cells you had in your body as a fetus, and there's just them growing and growing until eventually they reach the end of their senescence, and then you just can't grow any new cells. You do have new stem cells in your body that at any point they can start producing more new cells, and they're very controlled, and then from time to time they'll generate more new cells. You even generate new neurons in your brain. So the idea that your brain just stops growing new neurons is not true. They've discovered that if we do keep on growing new neurons all the way through our life, even when you're quite old, you're still generating new neurons, which helps you to be able, that you can learn new tricks as an old person. You can, and not just through using whatever you already got there, but for instance, if you learned a musical instrument as an old person, then that sort of thing that can be, maybe might need new neurons, not just new connections between brains cells, but maybe sometimes even new cells, to help your brain to kind of internalize whatever it is you're doing. So these sorts of things these actually do keep going on all the way through your life, right until you're very old. There's some level of new neurons being built in your brain when it's needed, as well as an awful lot of going on just actually neurons that are already there, growing a new connection to another part of your brain. And anyway, so I'm getting a bit distracted. I didn't mean to talk about that, but anyway, the immortal stem cells are throughout our body, and I shouldn't say too much because I'll probably say something wrong, something is mistaken. But these immortal cell lines, because I'm no expert on this, but these immortal stem cells don't need fetal tissue. That goes back to the first was in 1980s were the first cell cultures involving stem cells. It's, small clumps of them and things like that. And then we can now do it very easily. Not only that, we can take cells that are not stem cells and convert them into stem cells. So there's a huge amount of what we can do with modern technology. It's just extraordinary. And so the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines use these modern immortal stem cells in their cell lines, and they have no connection at all with any fetal tissue because they were in a different way. I don't know what they were donated from easily originally, but I mean, for instance, you could, for instance, get this bone marrow donation nowadays, much even simpler than that, and then extract some stem cells from them or make stem cells. And if you just have one stem cell, then you reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. There's no limit anymore. It has no limit of 20 billion tons, million tons or something. It can be just as much as you like, endlessly into the future. So even if we had, even if you somehow humans spread so they were around every star in the galaxy, it could still be using a cell line that came from humans in the 20th century, because it could just go on immortally. And even if you need trillions of tons of this cell culture for trillions and trillions for quadrillions or quintillions or whatever, sextillions of humans, you could still do it, because there's literally no limit. So so we never need to do anything with aborted fetuses anymore, and as far as I know, there just haven't been any since the 60s and 70s. Yes, so that's the cell lines, that early ways of making mRNA vaccines, but that they say that's okay as well. But they do say, so they can, and this is another a different group of Catholics saying, Catholics, this was the which one was it? The Pontifical Academy for Life, which is another group of said Catholics have a responsibility to push for the creation of moral, just alternative vaccines. So that is something that is also part of the Catholic view on all this, is that you do this because that's the way it's being done. But if you can in any way influence the ways of developing vaccines that don't use these cell lines, then for a Catholic that's quite important, that you can try and find a way to do that. So if you were a Catholic scientist, for instance, and if there was a different way of doing the research which didn't involve these cell lines, then you would try to move it that way, if it's possible. And influence, try and create the possibilities for other scientists to do the same. So you don't just say we'll just do it because that's the way it is. But for a Catholic, then it's quite important to have this idea that if you can move away from these cell lines, then you try to do that. But they can have confidence that if there's a great need and there are no alternatives, they're not forbidden from using these new vaccines. But there's much the Church calls us to do in seeking out alternatives and advocating for alternatives. But then, as the US Catholic Bishop said, that does not mean that you delay your vaccination because you want to use the alternative. Don't take it that far. But that's what they're recommending, because that is going against your Christian need to do what you can to benefit others and to look after your own health. And that's far more important than trying to delay a vaccine for these kind of reasons. This is more really for researchers or if you've got a choice. So, yeah, I've explained that already. So what else have I need to explain? I've explained that already. There's a nice video here you can go and watch by a doctor, or just a very, very short video that doesn't go into the level of detail that I have here of an expert. And then I've explained that, I think. I just want to explain, there are many vaccines that don't need human cell lines at all. A well-known example are the flu vaccines. I should be doing that, shouldn't I? I don't know if I've coughed for ages, that's just something in my throat. Anyway, if whenever you cough, people I always got, you might why I've got COVID. No, I know how to protect myself, and I do physical distance, and I'm actually in a very remote place in the countryside, but even I would know how to protect myself if I was in. Well, I used to say Wuhan, but now I would say London, because London's much worse than Wuhan ever was. But you should protect yourself very carefully. So there's one interesting COVID vaccine that's just entered phase 3, and that's Medicago. And that one, I think it's been in phase 3 for a few weeks now. And this makes no use of human cells. It doesn't even use animal cells. It doesn't use hen's eggs. It uses plants. It's grown in tobacco plants. And so a kind of variety of tobacco. I'm not necessarily commercial tobacco. I don't know what the actual species is. But they found a way of modifying the DNA of a plant so it would produce lots and lots and lots of the spike proteins. And so this is could be a very low-cost vaccine where you just basically grow plants, then you harvest them, and you purify what you've got, and you find you've got loads and loads of the protein spikes, and then you inject those in people, and that's your vaccine. And this one would have no connection, obviously, with anything to do with humans. It's just unless it was involved in the research. So, and just to say, if you were to be really kind of pernickety about this and say, I'm not going to do anything, have any drug that has any connection at any point with these human cell lines, then that would be quite difficult to do. Because in the 1960s and 1970s, if you wanted human cells and you needed to test your drug in some way, not in actual volunteers, but in some cell culture, then you would have no choice really. It would be very difficult to find human cells that you could test it in. So, so these really back in the 60s and 70s, this was the only way you could do an awful lot of stuff. And so, and of course, modern medicine has developed from the medicine of the 60s and 70s. So if you kind of very precious about it, as it were, and say, I'm not going to have anything to do with anything that's ever in any way benefited from medical research that involved these cell lines, even in the most indirect way, then it was really quite difficult you would have to research very, very carefully to try and find some medicines that, for instance, aspirin would be okay, I would expect. I don't know. I would have thought, through very traditional medicines and things, these things, that aspirin originally goes back to willows, and I wouldn't have thought there's been much research done much, but you'd have to check if you really were kind of very precious about this. But I don't think many people would go to anything like that extent. So, and it seems, as far as I can tell, most Christians will be absolutely fine with some. I think indeed the Catholics are really quite strict on this, and probably even stricter than most of the Protestants in the Bible Belt. But there will be some who have very strong views on this, and they may have to re-examine it. But the idea that you need your loving kindness, you love your neighbour, this kind of idea, and the importance of your own life, then I think that as it's of great significance that you're here in the world, then I think this is something that's common to Christianity all the way through. So that to not do that is more problematic for a Christian than to not protect yourself, not to protect others. That's much more of a problem, and really you should do that. So I think once they've worked it all the way through, there'll be very few that would say that you should, for this very remote thing where you've not got any connection. But it's for everyone to make their own decision about this, and I'm just giving you the background to it. Yeah, tiny little bit of extra information. You might enjoy the actual history behind it. So the actual history was that before 1962, and the polio vaccine goes back to the 1950s, then the Salk and the Sabin vaccine, polio vaccines, so the Sabin is the Salk one is the inactivated vaccine, which was used throughout the Americas, and the Sabin is the attenuated vaccine, which means that it was a weakened form of polio. The Sabin one is the one that caused all the problems because it worked absolutely fine in the initial tests in places like Russia, and it didn't cause any problems. But then, maybe partly because of hygiene and things, but it turned out that if this vaccine went through someone's body and in the digestive tract, it could mutate back to the original polio, and then this would do nothing in the body of the person who was vaccinated. But then when they excreted it, and then in contaminated water, then someone else could take it up from the water, and this would happen in places with not very good hygiene. And this led to the outbreaks that come back again, where in various ways from the fecal oral route, then the polio vaccine can, or just not very good hygiene or in home or something. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but this is why or any of this, but this is why the Sabin polio vaccine is the one that the wild type polio is eradicated from Africa, but you still have these little outbreaks which are actually the vaccine itself mutating. And the Gates Foundation have a big project to make a new vaccine, which is an inactivated, not inactivated, an attenuated vaccine that can't mutate back. And they have worked out how to do that with modern technology, which would have been absolutely impossible back then to do it at that level of precision. And the only reason that most of the world uses the Sabin polio vaccine is because a great deal less than the Salk vaccine. So in the Americas, the whole Americas, North and South America, they could afford to vaccinate everyone with the Salk vaccine. But in the rest of the world, they could only afford the Sabin vaccine. And so that's why polio was not eradicated half a century ago, basically because of this pricing problem. And, or whenever it was that it was eliminated from America, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure when it was. It could have been eradicated from the entire world. At the same point, it was eradicated from the Americas if the entire world had been able to afford the Salk vaccine. But sadly, it couldn't at those days. So that's one thing that's really very positive about COVID, that we are actually getting really high quality vaccine to the entire world, all in one go and with astonishing speed. Anyway, so I got distracted, sorry, but just a few minutes on that, but it's a very positive thing. So anyway, the original, in the 1950s to 1962, these polio vaccines were grown in cells. I'm not sure if it was cells from monkeys, not cell lines. I may have got that wrong. But the cells also contained monkey viruses, and one of them, SV40, gave laboratory hamsters lethal cancers. So they tested this vaccine on laboratory hamsters, and because of the monkey viruses that got into the vaccine, then the hamsters got these cancers. So they didn't actually prove that they would cause lethal cancers in humans, but the regulators were concerned about this, and they were not very keen on continuing to use this vaccine that could potentially, that they did know could cause cancers in hamsters. So that is why Leonard Hayflick at the Weisstar Institute at Philadelphia, and he thought, how can we solve this problem? Because that was the only way they knew how to make the vaccine. So then he had the idea of getting cells from one fetus, make sure they're clean and can't cause cancer, there's nothing nasty in them, and then use that to make the viral vaccines from then on. And so that's what he did. And at the time he did that, he had no idea about how much these cells from the fetuses could duplicate. So he used these fibroblast cells, and it was one particular, we've actually quite a bit of history behind this particular vaccine. So it was a Swedish woman, and she had several children already, and she decided she didn't want to have any more, and so it was an elective abortion, and so there's some problem, she didn't get on with her husband or something, there was some problem with her husband, and she didn't want to have any more children, but she was difficulty of stopping that from happening, and so she ended up having an unwanted child, and she chose to have an abortion, and she was nearly 4 months pregnant at the time she had this elective abortion. But remember, this is back in the 1960s. So this would have been donated to science as for scientific research, and then Hayflick and then it was flown over to the Americas, and because they were looking for an aborted fetus to do this with. And then it's actually, you can read up the history of there was a virologist, Sven Gard, he's the one who dissected it, and they were flown to Philadelphia, and then Hayflick used it to make the cell line called WI38. WI stands for the Weisstar Institute. I've already explained, they're just fetal fibroblast cells, and made from the connective tissue in the lungs of this particular fetus. And so all the rubella vaccines have been made from that particular cell line. And so that one fetus, and then some other vaccines as well, and the early polio vaccines, I think they may have changed since then, but certainly the early polio vaccines obviously were made in that particular cell line. I will repeat myself, they're not stem cells, they're connective tissue in the lungs of a fetus. And so I've explained all that before. And there was another one in the United Kingdom, and then there was another one, I think the one for Astrazeneca might have come from a 1970s abortion in the Netherlands. So there's a number of different cell lines from different abortions, but all many decades ago. And so you can actually, if you want to, if you're intrigued and you want to know the details, you can actually go back and look back and find the history and find out. Sometimes with the Netherlands one, they lost the details. So I think it was that one. So it would have been ethically obtained originally, but you can't find all these details about what exactly was the situation. But if you want to, you can actually read back for most of the vaccines of the cell lines. You can read back, and you will have obviously not the identified name or things like that, but some details, so you can get an idea and learn a little bit about the actual aborted fetus that is the original of the cell line that is being used for that particular vaccine. And so some people might find that something, can feel some kind of compassion for this fetus many decades ago, and then some kind of feeling that, from them, that so many people have benefited from the donation of that the mother made of the fetus to the vaccine cell line. So it's in a way you might certainly that's how Buddhists would think about it. Not saying it was it was a life that died that didn't need to die, but you're not able to do anything about that now. And so hopefully this will give you some idea about all this, and so you've got no, you're not directly or in any way connected to what actually happened. It's a very remote connection. It is not seen as a sin by Catholics, and it's still seen as something that in a kind of a way it's good if you've got the choice to have something that doesn't have this connection, but it's not something that you should be worrying about or in any way anxious about. There's nothing here that should cause you even a moment of anxiety, because it's absolutely clear. It's almost like a Christian duty, or even not quite duty, or Christian. It's the result of your love of your neighbour. This is what you're absolutely. It's fulfilling Jesus' teaching to get vaccinated, and I think you shouldn't have even a moment of hesitation about that. And that, especially with something as serious as COVID, if you have any risk of getting COVID and the vaccine is going to help stop you getting it, or going to help it going on to others, then from what I've read about how Catholics think about it, you shouldn't have even a moment of hesitation, and you shouldn't have any anxiety about it. This is absolutely right to do this. So that's my conclusion from reading up about what Catholics say about it. But this background is not explained properly in so many of the fact checks, and is so inadequate. They don't answer the questions that Catholics would want to know the answers to. They don't link to these bioethicists, and very few of them do link to these details, or to link to places where you can find out, and they get significant things wrong. So many of them give the impression that the Astrazeneca vaccine is not grown in a cell line, in any of these cell lines, which is not just false. They just got confused. It's quite difficult to do this kind of research, this kind of a fact check. It's just very technical, and you need to look very carefully and read very carefully what you're reading. So I'm not saying, most fact checks that I've checked have been excellent, but in this particular case, then one or two have been okay, have been good. But there was a good Reuters fact check, except it was just so confusingly written that I read all the way to the end of it, and it wasn't clear to me if the Astrazeneca vaccine was grown in one of these cell lines. They gave all sorts of details, but the details, and I'm used to reading scientific papers and all sorts, but this article by a journalist trying to summarize the science, and it was just so confusing. I couldn't figure out what this journalist was saying. Gave lots of details, but when you got to the end, it was hard to put the details together, so I had to find out for myself, and so I followed that one up. So it took quite a while to find these things, but I found some excellent sources, and so that's what I used. So anyway, hopefully this helps some of you, and will clarify this issue, which is quite an important issue for some people, and I hope this helps with some of the vaccine hesitancy amongst religious folk who and then just the infodemic of people who just haven't even checked the fact checks. So, but this is a much more thorough than, I don't know of any fact checks that have gone into this detail, into what it is. So hopefully I can help a bit with some of you to provide some of this background that is just so sadly missing on this topic. If you know of good fact checks that you've seen that actually go into this level of detail and explain it really well. So the Catholic ones give a summary of the results, but they don't go into the details of how they came to those results, not the level I've explained now. So those Catholic, this is kind of summary. This is what our conclusion is. But it was quite short. It didn't really explain very much background to it. So that's why I haven't just given you a link to one of those, because I felt the people I helped, some of you would want to know more than you can see in those, if you just read those links. So the article will be in the video description. I have a link to the article, and if you click through the article you find these other things. Oh, I just remembered I brought something up. I can't remember what it was, but I do remember bringing something up. Let's see if it was something important. No, there's something to do. Oh yes, Vatican. Oh yes, oh no, I already brought that up. So yes, this is the Vatican News. So they have, this is their actual statement. So I was talking about, this is not the actual statement, but I also have a link to the actual statement. So this is about the US bishops, and you can read the names of the US bishops, and this is a summary of it. So for Catholics, if you just want to have a summary of what they actually said, and you want to link through and read the statement, then this is, these are the main points. I will put this in the video description as a separate thing, because that will be very important for some of the people I help. If you just want to read what Vatican News wrote, then I'll put that there. But what I explained is the science behind it all, and in rather more detail as to what it's all based on, and filling out some of the ethical side of it as well, and the kind of Christian understanding of what it's all about. So anyway, okay, hopefully that helps you. Now I'll now upload this, and just a reminder, Facebook group Doomsday Debunked. That's what I do. This I'm helping people there with this, and but obviously other people as well. I have my Quora blog, which you'll see when you link through. But if you join the Facebook group Doomsday Debunked, either to help people as a fact checker or because you're scared of things, if you're going to be posting there or commenting there, please have a read of the rules at the head of the group, because they're very important for the particular people that we're helping there, and there's certain things you have to be careful about, and these rules are strictly enforced. It's very rule-based, because a lot of the people we help are autistic, and autistic people often they need things to be written out in lots of separate rules. They're very, very clear, and so it may seem rather a lot of rules, but it's pretty sensible. If you're not of autistic in the way you think about things, nevertheless the rules are pretty straightforward. They're just quite a lot of them. We don't just sort of say, you be thoughtful about others or something like that, because that's not the sort of thing that an autistic person can actually cope with as a rule very easily. So we say very clear things, and then it also means our moderator decisions. It's absolutely clear why we did what we did, because it's rule-based. So anyway, so do please, if you join the group and you're about to post something, it'd be a good idea to have a glance at the rules. You don't necessarily need to read them all, but especially get some idea of how the group works. And if you do break any of the rules, we don't immediately kind of do anything very forceful, unless it's something so really. Obviously, one of the rules, for instance, very clear rule, is don't suggest that someone don't try to encourage someone to kill themselves. I mean, that's a pretty obvious rule. It's extraordinary that we had to actually mention, actually had to put it in as a rule, but that's the. So most of them are pretty obvious things, and but some of them are for instance, the things about future dates. Then it's good to read that for false prophecies, and the various other things that are really quite important to just have a bit of a glance at, and how the group works if you join the group. Anyway, going on, they'll be clear enough if you have read them as to why we do all this. But if it's something very serious, we act very promptly and we will mute someone immediately and then talk to them and say and clarify why this rule is something that we had to enforce and why we had to step in so quickly. But if it's less serious, then we'll talk to you first before doing anything. And then once we feel the person involved has understood, then we will lift the mute. Or if that is just to make sure that they don't do anything while we're talking to them until it's all clarified. But anyway, I don't know why I said all that. I'll upload this, and hopefully this will help some of you.